Einen schönen guten Tag. Ich freue mich, Sie
Hello,
heute im Namen der
welcome. I'm
Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung
happy
zur
to be able to
Neuauflage des
welcome you on behalf
dekolonialen
of the
Dialogs begrüßen zu
Heinrich-Böll
dürfen.
Foundation
So welcome
to the
everybody
new
to the
edition of our decolonial
new edition
dialogues.
of our decolonial dialogues. Diese Veranstaltung ist digital
This
und
event
mehrsprachig.
is
Das heißt, es gibt eine
digital and
Übersetzung ins
multilingual
Englische,
event,
Französische
which
und
means
Deutsche.
that there will be a
Bitte
translation
nutzen
into
Sie dafür
German,
den
English, and
Webview-Button am
French.
unteren Ende
Please
Ihres
use the
Bildschirms.
globe button at
For
the
translation into
bottom
German,
of your
English, and
screen.
French, please press the little globe button on the bottom of your screen. Fast genau vor einem Jahr sind wir in die erste
Almost
Runde der
exactly a year
dekolonialen
ago,
Dialoge
we started
gestartet.
the first
Wir
round
freuen
of
uns
the
sehr, dass
decolonial
auch in diesem
dialogues.
Jahr das
We are very
Curatorial
happy
Team
that also this
Mahret
year
Ifeoma
the
Kupka,
curatorial team Mahret
Philmon
Ifeoma
Ghirmai
Kupka, Philmon
und Thomas
Ghirmai,
Fuß
and
die
Thomas Fuß
Veranstaltungsreihe mit Leben füllt.
fill the event series with life.
Nach der heutigen Auftaktveranstaltung
After
zur
today's kickoff
Inhaltsdiskussion zu den
event on the content and
Dekolonialisierungsdebatten in Europa
direction
und
of
Afrika geht es
decolonization in
darüber,
Europe and
dass diese
Africa,
Veranstaltung
our
im Mai die
second event
unterschiedlichen
in May will
Perspektiven der
focus on different
Zusammenarbeit nach
perspectives
der
of
Rückgabe
cooperation
kolonialer Raum
after the
betrachtet.
restitution
Das
of
dritte
colonial
Gespräch im Juni
looted
fragt nach
arts. The
Möglichkeiten für
third
wechselseitige
conversation
Mobilität
in
zwischen den
June
Kontinenten.
asks about
Der letzte
possibilities for
Dialog in diesem
reciprocal
Jahr
mobility
befasste sich
between the
mit der Rückgabe der
continents. The
Beziehungen Mensch
last
Natur.
dialogue of this year in
Zwei
September will
Veranstaltungen
deal with the
finden Sie bereits
relationship
jetzt auf unserer
between man
Webseite.
and nature. You can already register
Die
for all events
Auseinandersetzung
on
mit
our
dem kolonialen
website.
Erbe, um
You
die
will
es
find the
schließlich
link
bei den
in the
dekolonialen
chat.
Dialogen geht,
The examination of the
ist ein
colonial
widersprüchlicher
heritage, which is the
und
subject of
verallgemeinerter
the
Prozess,
decolonial
der in einer
dialogue, is an
breiten
often
öffentlichen und
contradictory
politischen
and above all
Rezeption in Deutschland,
open
aber auch in
process,
Europa
which in
beim
its broad
Ausmaß ansteigt.
public and political
In der heutigen
reception in Germany,
Auftaktveranstaltung
but
wollen wir mit
also
Ihnen
in
eine
Europe,
Hilfe
is
zur
unfortunately
Sinneswandlung
still in its
darüber
infancy.
besprechen, was
In today's kickoff
Dekolonialisierung
event, we
ist
want to
und ob
look at the
europäische
overall picture and
Dekolonialisierung
talk
gelingen kann.
about what
Gibt es
decolonization
vielleicht
actually is
Übereinstimmungen und
and whether or
Unterschiede in der
how decolonization can succeed.
afrikanisch-europäischen
Where
Debatte?
are the
Und wie
similarities and
können wir
differences in
produktive
the European
Differenzen
and African debates,
gesellschaftliche
and how
Unterstützung
can we
und
deal
Wechselaltern erzeugen?
productively with
Für
differences
eine
and
neue
generate
Beziehungsebene zwischen
social and
Afrika und Europa soll
social
es
support
Veranstaltungen
for
geben,
our
die diese
concerns?
dekolonialen Dialoge führen
For a
möchten.
new ethics
Vor dem
of
Hintergrund der
relation between
Rivalität
Africa and
zwischen
Europe, this
Afrika
is
und
the
zwischen den
claim
beiden
with which we would
Kontinenten
like to
können
conduct the
systemische
decolonial
Ansätze zur
dialogues. Against the
Dekolonialisierung und
background of
Dialog
history
gefunden werden.
between the two continents that has been intertwined
Wichtig
over
hier, dass
centuries,
unterschiedliche
systemic
Perspektiven
approaches to
zuzuordnen und
decolonization
auch
can only
gehört
be
werden
conceived
müssen.
in a dialogue.
Für den
Different
heutigen
perspectives
Dialog
and
freuen
voices
wir uns
should have
vielfach
their
aus
say
Senegal, aus
and be
Tansania und
heard.
Deutschland gewinnen.
We are
Wir
pleased to
laden
have
Sie
voices
dazu
from
ein,
Senegal,
sich für die
Tanzania, and Germany with us
internationale
for today's
Diskussion
dialogue, and we are also happy
Multilateralisierung
about the
und
international
freuen uns
audience
über Ihre
today. We
große
invite you
internationale
all to join the
Zustimmung.
dialogue after the panel
Sehr
discussion, and we'll
geehrte
try to
Teilnehmer
let
der
as many
sechsten
people as
Decolonial
possible have their
Dialogs.
say. We also encourage
Wir
you
freuen uns
all
sehr,
to
dass
become
wir deshalb
active
in
on
Rahmen
Twitter
dieses
under the
Jahres alle 4
hashtag
Dialoge mit
decolonial
moderieren.
dialogues. And we're very
Aisha
pleased
ist
to have
zuständig
Aisha
für
Kamara as moderator for
Diskriminierungsmoderator
all 4
und
dialogues again this year.
interkulturellen Dialog.
Aisha is a discrimination critical
Doch
communication expert and
bevor wir
moderator.
mit
She will also
weiteren
introduce our
Teilnehmenden
speakers
starten,
today, but
sollten
first
wir
we will hear
Folgendes
Philmon
klären.
Ghirmai with a
Philmon
short
ist der
introduction to the
Vorsitzende der
debate
Bündnis
around
90 Die
decolonization.
Grünen,
Philmon is the state chairman of Bündnis
Co-Koordinator
90 Die
des
Grünen,
Dialogs.
co-curator
Sprechen
of
Sie
these
uns bitte
dialogues,
in
and much
15
more.
Minuten
Herewith, I hand over and wish you a lot of
The floor
food
is
for
yours.
thought. Philmon, the floor is yours.
Vielen Dank, liebe Maria.
Many thanks, dear
Ich darf
Maria.
Sie im Namen des Kuratorinnen-Teams, das aus
I have the pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the curatorial team. It consists of Mahret Kupka, Thomas Fuß, and myself. We are very pleased that the Heinrich-Böll Foundation is making it possible to continue this series, decolonial dialogues. And we all know that, especially in a dialogue format, the role of the moderator is central. All the more are the three of us happy that the wonderful Aisha Kamara will accompany once again and lead us through the conversations. The first part of the series took place last year. It served to prepare the ground for a common reflection on the colonial past. In terms of content, it was important for us to show the different layers of societies, actors, and discourses. So we talked about different memory policies in the Federal Republic of Germany and Eastern Germany, about the visibility and invisibility of Black life in both republics, what a critical exchange about the restitution debate and about the meaning and interpretation of objects. Or in another event, we deconstructed the image of the Nobel Prize winner European Union, whose founding history is saturated with the late colonial agenda. One thing is clear for us. Colonialism may have formally ended, but an egalitarian relationship between European and African states and societies still does not exist. This includes political, economic, and cultural relations. On the other hand, it also includes the question of joint remembrance itself. At the core of every event, we were and still are moved by the question of how a common memory and critical reappraisal of the colonial past can actually look, and on what its success depends. In this country, colonialism and its consequences are still present everywhere, whether it's street names that honor colonizers, looted art that's exhibited in museums, textbooks that reproduce unfiltered colonial language and images, or of course, the racism that many people experience every day. It is Black activists and academics, in particular, who are driving the discourse. Often they see themselves, or we see ourselves, opposing reactionary forces. Initiatives for street renaming are openly opposed with hostility. References to the illegitimate acquisition of art and objects, many of which are found in the collections of German museums, are repeatedly rejected with a lot of fuss. And academic as well as political institutions still reproduce themselves in terms of content and personnel instead of practicing self-criticism and promoting polyphony. The curators are convinced, as long as there's no willingness to give up privileges, as long as there is no willingness to question one's own thought patterns, historiographies, and walls of order, a dialogue of equals is not possible. But that is exactly what we want to achieve with this series. We are convinced, in order to advance decolonization, the discourse framework must be broken. It is not for a German society to negotiate the colonial past in a monologue with itself, but this is exactly what happens in this country when we get entangled in the same superficial debates over and over again. Decolonization must be polycentric and polyphonic per se. It cannot be pursued unilaterally from the former colonial metropolises, nor can there be any unilateral sovereignty of interpretation over the common past from within them. With this series, we want to invite people to break away from themselves, to listen, think together, to deconstruct together, and to build new relationships. We understand this series, as well as ourselves, as a learning in progress with learners. So today, the second round of the decolonial dialogue starts. Beginning, it will again be about creating a common basis. And together with our guests, we will start a conversation about the different ideas and discourses about decolonization exist in Senegal, West Africa, Tanzania, and East Africa, and Germany. And in the following events, we will deal in depth with the topic of restitution, focusing on the question of what actually happens or what should happen when those objects are returned. In June and September, we will also explore new colonial topoi that continue to strongly shape our thoughts and actions today. On one hand, we will talk about mobility, migration. This will include the question of who is allowed to travel and who's not, but also the question of what the significance of travel is for the colonial project. In addition, we will talk about nature and conservation as colonial and post-colonial project. Are there images of wilderness, worthy of protection, or the systematic exploitation of raw materials? Both have a colonial core that we want to explore. For today, on behalf of the curatorial team, I wish us all good exchange and fruitful discussions, and would now like to hand over to Aisha Kamara.
Thank you so much, dear Philmon, for the introduction, and I'm quite happy. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I can also connect to what you said in my welcoming word. So we're very I have the hope that this year I'll be able to sort out a few things that are on my mind, because for my biography as well as for my work, colonialism or decolonization has always played a role, because I'm the daughter of a former Guinean opposition politician. And this means that Samori and Sekou Touré, I do not know from books, but I learned about them on my uncle's lap. And whenever I talk about Pan-Africanism or decolonization in Germany, I noticed that there are so many discourses that run past each other. That too is a product of brutal colonial rule. We do not know each other. That is also why, as the curators describe it, it's about a new ethics of relationships. We have to connect and we have to find a joint space in order to talk with each other and not about each other. And this is not only important for this dialogue and this conceptual pair Europe and Africa, but also for the spaces in between. And therefore, I'm quite happy and looking forward to today's event and also the other events. And in this at this event, I would like to welcome our interlocutors. I would like to kindly ask you to turn on your camera. Great, welcome. It's good to see all of you here. It's great that we can meet in a multi-perspective round, so to speak, and in the upcoming 2 hours, we would like to discuss. I would also like to welcome the audience now. Of course, you should also participate in the discussion. We have different possibilities to do that. On the one hand, we have the Q&A function where you can, starting now, enter your questions and also the chat function. But at the end of our panel discussion, we would like to open the format up in order to allow you to take the floor, and you could also join us with your video and audio, so you could raise your question in person. Now I would like to welcome the panelists. First of all, Professor Mame-Penda from the Gaston Berger University in Saint Louis in Dakar. She's a professor and researcher at the university and is the first female political scientist in the Senegal. She's director of the Laboratory for the Analysis of African and Diaspora Societies and Powers, and she's also deputy dean of the Faculty of Law and Political Sciences and professor of political science. She's the head of the Laboratory for the Analysis of African and Diaspora Societies and Powers, LASPAD. So welcome to you, Professor Mame-Penda. I'd also like to welcome Hamado Dipama from the umbrella organization of the Integration Advisory Councils in Bavaria. And he came from Burkina Faso about 20 years ago and arrived in Munich, and today is engaged in different ways for better living conditions for Black people and refugees. And Hamado Dipama is a consultant for anti-racism and anti-discrimination work at the umbrella organization of the Integration Advisory Boards in Bavaria, also called AGABI. Welcome to you, Hamado Dipama. And another panelist is Nicholas Calvin Mwakatobe. He's a filmmaker and photographer from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Nicholas, whose main focus is stories and intersectionality, geography and interaction with each other, and how stories define us and influence us, and how they shape the stories we tell ourselves as we deal with the question of existence. And the fascination has always been with stories and narratives in particular. So he will also talk about a film project that he has shown in Germany. So welcome to Nicholas Calvin Mwakatobe. And last but not least, I'd also like to welcome Dr. Mahret Ifeoma Kupka. She's been briefly introduced as a co-moderator of this series. She's an art scholar and curator at the Museum for Applied or Angewandte Kunst, basically, in Frankfurt. And In her exhibitions, lectures, texts, and interdisciplinary projects, she addresses the issues of racism, memory culture, representation, and also decolonization of art and cultural practices in Europe. She's also part of the curatorial team of the event and think tank series, Talking Objects Lab. So she's here and representing different perspectives. So it's great that you're here, dear Mahret. So, as I already said before we start with the discussion, I would like to tell the people in the audience you are welcome to participate via the Q&A function and also in the open discussion after the panel discussion. So now I would like to start with the discussion right away. So for me, decolonization is a buzzword in Europe. Of course, I have quite a clear German perspective when it comes to decolonization or post-colonial or pan-Africanism. So these are basically buzzwords. So when we pick these buzzwords, it's a question to all of you. How would you define these terms? And do you work with these terms, decolonization, for example? Maybe Professor Penda.
Tout d'abord, vraiment, merci pour avoir organisé cette
welcome. Thank you very much for organizing this dialogue with colleagues from other regions, from different countries. In order to start with a question, this question is very important with regard to the definition. I would say that there are two opposing terms which are quite close. Nevertheless, this is the concept of decolonization and decoloniality. This is not the same thing. So we worked a lot on that. Decolonization is used quite frequently. It's a political movement eventually, and this leads to political sovereignty. So this is what it is about. But we saw quite quickly that decolonialization did not help us to break up with something that is quite significant. So decoloniality. So decolonization is an important political process. It is important, as I said, but it can only be the starting point of the overall fight, because we have to fight. We have to fight this thing that lingers on, that continues, even though in those states that have reached their independence. So the concept of decoloniality is very important because it goes much farther. It's much more radical, and we have to take a close look. What do we see as in terms of decoloniality in the different states, the independent states, Africans, Latin Americans or Asians live there, but still they reproduce the same structures, the same symmetries, the same kind of racism and sexism, and also the same exploitation of natural resources. So decoloniality is a concept which is very important to me, and we need a radical thinking. We should not only stay in the theoretical realm here. When decoloniality and decolonization are not only metaphors, but are basically practices of an active transformation of all places, institutions, and relations, then we have to be able to use this as a strong and critical concept and have to give a practical answer. What does it mean? Decolonialized administrations, decolonialized universities, a decolonialized state, a decolonialized international relations. So this is what it is about. This is what's very important from my point of view. Thank you very much. Nicholas, as a filmmaker, as a photographer, would you describe yourself or consider yourself as a decolonialized a filmmaker? I'm sure this is a term that is used in your connection, but I would like to hear from you. What would you say?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think when we talk about colonialism and its subsequent legacy, I think as the system officially, it's on paper that it was over, but the lasting legacy of it continues because it is embedded within the system in which we live, especially like geopolitical relation between Germany and Tanzania specifically, but Europe and Africa or former colonies. And these things exist in terms of like what story, who has a control of what stories are being told, because where the mind goes, the body follows. Where the mind goes, policy follows. Where the mind goes and the stories that are told, they shape the populations, they shape sort of like policies that governs how bodies are body can move through space, knowledge can move through space, how wealth flows. All these things are predicated upon policies that are different governments sort of like set in motion. And these laws and policies that governs essentially governs the bodies and the movement of our bodies and the relations between bodies is predicated upon the individuals that bring them into existence. And as we know, the system within which we all function find its roots within colonial system, find its roots within this asymmetrical power relation between former colonial powers and sort of like a colonized former colonized domains. So we can find that, and within my specific field of storytelling, yeah, I could definitely trace how certain aspect of colonialism exists and still shapes the minds and shapes relations between these two spaces. I mean, you have, for example, you could talk about places of memories and memory culture. You could talk about mass media in terms of, for example, I can give this example that I was once, there was a time that I was working in a street in Germany, it was during Christmas. And then at that time, the imagery that I see of a people that look like me is the poster child African poster child of like this hungry child, malnourished and pleading for help. This is the very common imagery that is sort of like, for example, in the minds of what Africa has been defined within sort of like this modern context, when the media is sort of like speaks about the continent, is all about hunger or devastation or war. Is this kind of story, you could trace them back, that even though the intentions, sometimes they say the intention is good, but you could trace this from as far back as how were the image of a Black body represented within European context, whether be it within the museum or being within sort of like European public consciousness, or being within European or German school system. How is the other contextualized? How is the other being portrayed as? And this story lives from generation to generation, continually, almost subconsciously, subliminally, shaping what whole population think about this whole space. You could even see, for example, like in terms of story, you could look, for example, even for example, as something that is so embedded within our global communication. Let's say like about maps, like how is the size of Africa on the map compared to Europe and and North America, let's say, right? So even so it's subtle, but it communicates something. It's smaller than the actual size, and whenever you're referring a person, it's very common to hear, for example, a person saying, for example, listing America, England, Germany, and Africa. You know, so these ones are individualized as countries, but this one, the whole geography that is a continent with its diversity, individualized as a lump, sort of like a one mass. So I think we can look at, and how do we do, for example, like how looking within space, how are these stories defined? So in the end, within my field is that colonialism is still so much present in many different forms within, even within storytelling and the way we consume media and information.
Ja. Vielen Dank für diese Einordnung erstmal.
Many thanks for this first overview. Mahret, we have heard it once again, colonial legacy, colonialism. This is something that is quite present. We see the traces everywhere. But in order to come back to the German context, yes, of course, we do have a colonial past, but then in a way we have a desire, a willingness. This is underpinned by the serious different projects that are promoted. So there is a tendency towards decolonization, or maybe this is a question mark. So the question to you, how do you work with this and deal with this issue? Yes, Aisha, many thanks for the introduction. A lot has been said already, and I fully agree. I would like to add just one aspect. When you introduced me, you said that I was dealing with decolonizing culture and arts world, and here in Germany and in the African continent, and I'm part of Talking Objects, where we organize different events that are titled like Decolonizing Knowledge, Nature, Decolonizing Restitution. This was the name of our last event, and this buzzword, as you rightly said, appears everywhere. And indeed, it is a buzzword. This is how I would name it myself, because the word or the concept appears in so many different contexts that it describes the idea that museums can be decolonized, because this is the area I come from. This is why I talk about that aspect. And I have the impression as if we had this list of 10 bullet points, and we simply have to go through this to-do list. So once we have achieved going through this decolonial process, then we have a decolonized museum. But then when I'm asked what is the state of affairs, state of art in Germany, and then I do have a hard time giving the right response. What do you want me to tell you? We're at point 5 in our to-do list. But there's an idea to offer anti-discrimination courses for employees, and then we might have the restitution of a few looted objects, and then we employ a person of color, and then we can label ourselves being a decolonized museum. So this is sometimes the impression that I get that is expected for me to tell. And this is a bit the direction that we are heading when we're talking about decolonization. This is why I try to leave this concept out of my language. I talk about colonialities or decolonialities, because the idea that there is a process that as an outcome has something positive, something decolonized. And I don't think that there is such a thing as this process. There is the fact of colonialism, colonial times. It has caused a series of events that cannot be taken back. And I think the concept of decolonization implies that you have the possibility to make things right again, to decolonialize, which is not possible. I think we have to acknowledge that colonialism really happened, and that what happened still has an impact on how we live, on how we work and interact, and that shape and mark life in Europe, on the African continent. And this is why I try to divert the focus of my work towards the future, to think about the world in which we would like to live together. How should this world look like? How should it work? Where we are all on an equal footing and have the same rights. And it might go into an imaginary world or in a utopian world in some of those projects I work with. But I think this is what we have to create. We have to create a world the way we would like to see it. And art is playing an important role with that. We are working together with many different artists. And therefore, my response or my answer to your question of how I would define or see the state of affairs when it comes to decolonization is that I try to move away from this concept because it has something awkwardly backwarded. Yeah, to try to redo or undo things that definitely have happened. And so what do we do with it? I mean, how do we move on? So I think it's about acknowledging what happened and move towards a better future. Many thanks, Mahret. Now we have been offered a different spectrum, different ideas, and I would like to ask Hamado Dipama in order to get a little bit more into detail. So what did decolonization mean for you when you grew up in Burkina Faso, or what meaning does it have for your work now in Munich and the south of Germany? First of all, many thanks for the invitation to have me in this wonderful round of experts here. So what does this concept mean for me in my life back in Burkina Faso and now here in Germany? A lot has been said already. I would like to move in a direction that Mahret put it. In Burkina Faso, we talk about colonialism and the reappraisal of this process, because we are still in the middle. We still live in a colonial system. A few days ago, I just came back from Burkina Faso, and the situation there really confirms for me once and again that we are still dealing with a colonial system, and so or maybe a post-colonial system, however you would like to put it. Since 2014, we have evidenced some major changes in the country that is remaining unfinished. And we had a change of power, different changes of power, and sorry, the sound quality is really bad. It's really hard to understand them. France has come forward and trying to have a different role on the continent, to withdraw military forces, and but the colonial system is still present. And here in Germany, colonialism is quite present. In Munich, we fight hard in order to rename streets that are still named after colonial leaders. And we do not understand how those street names can still be there, since we know about the history. We know that in the 30s, the majority of street names have been renamed to people that have committed massacres in Africa, on the African continent, in Namibia, in Tanzania, and in Cameroon. How is it possible that those people are honored bearing the name of the street? And we know exactly that this is one of the biggest honors a city can issue. And this, in light of the knowledge that we have now about these times, is simply unacceptable. And this is something that we have to change. And until that is still in place, we cannot talk about decolonization. We still live in a certain colonial order that we have to reprise.
Vielen, vielen Dank. Ich finde das jetzt schon einfach
Thank
sehr
you very much. I think it's quite interesting because in Germany, colonialism has almost been replaced because everything is decolonialized now. Maybe it's a strategy to avoid it. And now we hear voices from the continent that it's not yet the right point of time. We still have to deal with colonialism instead of already saying that we were decolonializing, and this already shows it. And this was the starting point of our discussion, that the discourses in the different countries are quite different. Now I would like to look further into the discourses in your countries you work in and live in. And Nicholas, I would like to ask you, and we will stay with Hamado's image. We want to talk about colonialism and the reappraisal. So how is this being discussed in your country and in East Africa?
Könnte eingefroren sein. So sieht es für mich aus. Deswegen würde ich.
It seems frozen. So this means that I would like to refer to Professor Barr first. So how's the situation in terms of the discussion when it comes to reappraisal of colonialism in the Senegal? I mean, there are different areas, the political field, civil society, and also the university that you are working at.
Oui. Je pense que c'est très important de rappeler que.
Well, I think it's very important to remember decoloniality and the consequences. It has a double function. It is a movement. You think about colonialism, the asymmetries, the power structures, that's what you already mentioned. And at the same time, it's also a concept. It allows you to think about new concepts of relationships with the other. So decoloniality, this is something that forces us to imagine a different world. It goes from criticism to proposals of new concepts. Where do we stand at the moment? So it's quite a useful concept, this concept of decolonial. It's a useful concept. And now I would like to talk about the Senegal and West Africa and the discussions there. So West Africa is French dominated, influenced. So there's usually a debate about the real sovereignty in terms of policy, economics, and also financial or monetary ways. So the countries have a currency where we see this currency connection via France with Europe. So this is a kind of control by France on the economy of the France-CFA region. And this currency policy is not really appreciated by society and by politics. So everything that you already heard the military, the control over the territories, the presence of the French armed forces that are still there remind us of that control. This whole area is controlled, is monitored by France, and there's a possibility to have an influence or have a say at any minute. And of course, there's also the overall discussion about resources. There are a lot of natural resources in our countries. In the Senegal, for example, we frequently talk about how should we deal with natural resources. We have discovered large natural gas and crude oil resources, and we are discussing how to deal with these resources. And the fossil resources, should we continue to use them? And this means also accelerating climate change. So will we stay in this capitalistic systems, or do we want to use the local knowledge and realize the visions of the people on the ground, which is not really fitting into this neoliberal economic model? So do we want to use our natural resources based on the local knowledge, which is extremely important? So the resources have not been exploited, but we're already discussing how we should deal with these issues. And civil society and the whole political sphere, the social movements in the area, this is quite unusual. There's a certain distortion. So what is happening in the cultural scene, urban cultural scene, for example, we see hip hop, and we see that they take a stance with regard to decoloniality, but there are also other suggestions that are being expressed, and those who are lagging behind are basically the academics in our country, unfortunately. I'm sorry that I have to say this, and also the politicians. So actually the young generation is at the forefront. They are marching ahead, so to speak, and we, the academics, and also the politicians, are still entrapped in a patriarchal, masculine structure. So it is about the recognition of the colonial model in our country, and the politicians are making use of it. They talk about sovereignty, independence, restitution. It's all very important. The Senegalese president, for example, chairs the African Union, and he talked about cultural independence. The whole room applauded him. However, we had a social movement first. They made the first steps. So there's some kind of awakening in the political and social spheres, but we had the grassroots movement at the beginning, and it has not yet reached the academic sphere. We are clearly influenced by a hierarchy in politics and in the academia, and it's very difficult for these areas to emancipate themselves and to fight for it. So civil society is much better equipped to do that.
Vielen Dank auch für die Beispiele, total interessant. Und jetzt natürlich.
Thank you very much. This is also very interesting. Now we would like to look at Tanzania and Africa. So would you agree to that the grassroots is important here, that the civil society has this topic high on top of the agenda, and in contrast to the academia and the political world? What would you say for East Africa?
Yeah, so I think like I was speaking mostly from my experiences within the art world and cultural sector, and is that there is, if you listen, there is an echo of certain sentiment about that poke holes into sort of like established structures that sort of like, in a way, they thrive on the premise of speaking the right language when it comes to addressing issue of colonialism. And I think there is a distinction between speaking the right words and speaking the right and having know your way around the discourse and the point where action is required. And I feel like within so for example, if you go to the people, and I'm speaking here we went to interview some people with the question of thinking about, for example, objects that are stored in the holdings of museums in Europe that finds their origin here in East Africa, and especially here in Tanzania. And what do people think of those things? And of course, you kind of feel like there is a need to have a definitive action in terms of what should be done and what can be done. And that stand in contrast to what, for example, if you go within Germany and you listen to people within this museum circle, what is it they're talking about, you can find a bigger contrast. So on one hand, for example, at least from my experiences coming to Germany as a Tanzanian, you find that this process of thinking about colonialism or thinking about ways of addressing the colonial legacy, it's sometimes there's a tendency to individualize the process, to say, if I do this thing, if my museum did this action, if I as a person, I'm not a bad person, I'm not a hateful person, then I'm addressing the colonialism. If my small museum say the right words and say this is kind of museums, this is kind of thinking that we have, and we have a goodwill to do something, then I'm involved in the process of decolonization, which is totally not true, and it's missing the point, because the point is the colonial system. Colonialism was a system, and as the system, I like this theory. It's a law that says like every system, in order to persist over time, it has to continue itself. It has to create within itself possibility of evolution, seed within a seed, to give birth to its own, right? Such has happened with colonialism in the sense that it has not ended. A lot of these systems are in place and strong. They limit how people move. They limit how resources are distributed. They limit who has access to knowledge. And it's beyond the sentiment of a single person to say like, oh, if I do this as an individual, then I'm sort of like getting over that process. So, and when you come to people within Tanzania, there is the need. I feel like there's there's a need to sort of like deal with these things at the practical level. There are things that, for example, within the art community, as an artist, when you want to speak about certain things, what are the limitations that you have? Let's say you're a local academician, or you're a local student, or you're a local artist from Tanzania. What opportunities do you have, for example, in terms of movement compared to a person from Germany? If I have to move there, no matter the reason, this is not saying that I want to go to Germany. It's just like, if you observe the fact you want to move from here to there, you have to submit. It's like you're writing a dissertation. You have to tell, do you have land? Are you married? Your mother's, father's, it's like it's insane in terms of like what hurdles you have to go through just to have a freedom to move. Whereas if a child from Germany, a student from Germany, and you meet them here, I mean, what are you doing? I'm doing an exchange program, or I'm in this internship somewhere. What do you have to go through to get that? Oh, I just have to fill in the form and online and pay a fee, and I'm here, right? So, right, and this is like blatantly shameless systems that are instituted and are ongoing today. And the way of addressing them is usually depending on who is starting this conversation. If it's from Germany, it's always talked about as this kind of like forward-thinking way of helping. It's always contextualized as like altruistic act of museums, altruistic act of German government. So even within the language, you listen to them, they tell you like, oh yeah, for example, with the issue of material or places of memory, the argument is like, oh, Africa they do not have political or economic or infrastructure capacity to take care of these certain objects that were stolen in the first place, right? So within that argument itself, and say like, okay, what we should do is, from German perspective now, they say like what we should do is help our partners to build capacity so that they are in a place where they will take care of these things. Help. I mean, but what is left out within that argument is that the first thing that made Europe rich, that made Germany rich, was based on extractive economies, economic models that was based on colonialism, that was based on unfair extraction. That is still continues today. And in talking about that, the very language itself is biased towards promoting certain narratives. Whereas if you come, for example, within people in the grassroots, one of the things that you have, and I'll give you this as a last example, is that, for example, when we're talking about masks, like, okay, masks has to be returned. And people say like, yeah, definitely mask has to be returned. But also, an important thing that needs to be returned is a dinosaur's bones that are at the Angewandte Kunst Museum. We can recreate some of the masks. We cannot recreate the dinosaur's bones, right? But if you, so people point out towards the scope, not only of these objects, but also of objects such as like natural history, remains of like dinosaurs' bones. But if I was talking to somebody from the Angewandte Kunst Museum, they told me like, but I don't think what you will say, like, I don't think that the dinosaurs' bones qualifies to be returned because they are a heritage of humanities. They go beyond culture, right? So I feel like it's like, wait a minute, but these things were taken within colonial context, right? So I feel like there is a difference in recognition of what has to be done and what's the way forward when you talk from people within sort of like maybe the academia or the politician or the people that are working with the museums and the people on the ground in terms of like what have to be done, you know? So for me, I'm more curious about those discrepancies between how do we think about these things? How do we think about these processes? How do we honestly say what would it really take to address, not to erase? Because one of the persons said like, you cannot bring back the dead. You killed a lot of people. There is no way of bringing that back. But the starting point is to address that, is to come to face with it and be open to what that would lead, what future will that open up? But it's the question of like erasing what happened.
Vielen Dank. Hinweis an alle.
Many things. So just a notice for all those who want to take part in the discussion, please raise your hand or to speak out whenever you want to add on or comment on what's been said. I would like to hand over to Mahret. She is known for having worked in different cultural contexts, so arts contexts in Europe and on the African continent. We just briefly touched upon the big field of restitution. So where are we right now when it comes to restitutions? So state of affairs, bullet point 7, I'd say. But when I come back to what's been said by Nicholas, I'd like to put this in a bit of a more complex framework, because Nicholas was talking about visa requirements, about freedom of movement, and the difficulties that we have for people coming from the African continent. And this, of course, is quite different when we talk about people having a European passport. So they have a lot more freedom of movement, and it's easier for them to be part of debates, to be even present. And I'd like to complicate this a bit more by saying that on one hand, this is true, but on the other hand, the Germans well, are not always German. And so within Germany, we have a huge diversity. We have different debates. Hamado was talking about the difficulty of renaming streets, the acknowledgement of colonial times, because in Germany and in Europe, we don't have the pure German or pure European people. So our social realities are quite interwoven or entangled. And there is a huge African diaspora that, or many other people from other countries as well. But so we do have quite a big and active diaspora that is taking part in those debates and that are active in different groups. I was briefly talking about those art projects where I work within talking objects, and many of those questions raised by Nicholas and the need that he revealed are taken up by, for example, talking objects. And we ask those questions to the political leaders and to those in power. But the problem is that those groups and initiatives are not usually well heard. They are underfunded and therefore do not really occupy those spaces or do not have the possibility to change the bigger picture. And from my perspective, from the work that I do, I see a huge need to exchange ideas between the initiatives that we have on the African continent and those diasporan groups, that we have a better mutual understanding in order to really strengthen those initiatives and to improve the situation when taking part in those debates here on the ground. I can give you an example from my work within talking objects. 2 years ago, we organized a bigger event, a cooperation of a German team of curators and an African or Kenyan team of curators. We had a bigger digital conference. We were still in the middle of the pandemic, so we organized an online event, but we thought that this gave us the possibility to decentralize the debate, and not as always we invite African participants to Germany, if it is possible even. Nicholas was talking about the difficulty of traveling.
Sondern wir konnten eben in den digitalen Raum gehen und wir konnten vor allem
the possibility to move to the digital space. And we gained a festival center a venue in Nairobi in Kenya. So it was really interesting for us to move the perspective and to look towards Nairobi and not having them looking towards Germany. It was all very well documented. There was a good media coverage. And then afterwards, they all talked about only the portion that took part in Nairobi. So this event was then relabeled being an African event, although it was a clear co-production between Germany and Kenya. And it was all about creating this space where we come together, have a common debate, and to see together what we really need in order to move forward together. And this was simply ignored. I mean, it did not receive any attention. And I just spent 2 months in Nigeria, did some research in the industry, because I was really interested about the restitution debate in Nigeria. And just recently, a few of the Benin Marcel bronzes have been returned to Nigeria. So I was really interested in the debates on the ground. I know that in Germany we have quite complex and diverse debates, different positions, and it should not be surprising that this debate in Nigeria is at least as complex and multi-layered as we have it here in Germany, but we hardly hear anything about it. Nicholas briefly said so that in the projects we have the feeling that in the so-called countries of origin, people are not able to take care of those looted artifacts, and nobody really asks why this is the case. This does have a colonial cause, so one would have to look into the structure of museums. What spaces do we need where those objects could be returned to? I mean, it's difficult to use the concept of return because they have not been robbed from the museums, but from different cultural contexts. So the question is of where are they returned to? We do have those debates on the African continent, but we hardly hear anything about it here in Germany. At least when you read the classical media, talk to the people that usually receive the space to talk about it. But there are indeed other spaces of encounter, other networks that are hardly covered by the media. They hardly have any visibility. Or people look the other way because the fact or the reality is that we already have an ongoing debate, and it might be too complex. So there's no easy solution. It's a very complicated, very complex situation, and people might avoid the complexity of it and try to look for an easy solution. And to come to an end of my contribution, I would call upon the possibility of having a bigger network, of having the African diaspora participate in this process, because there's a lot of knowledge, very valuable potential that necessarily should be part of the debate, of course. Thank you so much, Mahret, for your perspective and for those who are actively interacting here in our QA tool. And in just a second, we will come back to your questions, but I still have a few questions on my list. I would like to add on the deficiencies. And there are gaps and deficiencies when it comes to the involvement of the scientific perspective from the African continent. So maybe Mrs. Barr wants to say something about it, because policy research is a field of action where she works in.
En réalité, je suis la rédactrice en chef d'une nouvelle revue panafricaine internationale.
Yes, indeed. I'm the editor-in-chief of a new Pan-American magazine that's called Global Africa.
Les enjeux globaux à partir du continent africain.
And in this magazine, we have try to take a perspective of the global challenges of the African continent, a southern, global south perspective, and the research policy and the academia. We still see that colonial times are questioned. The efficiency of decoloniality is rethought. So we are all part of the society where knowledge is produced, and this is a framework that has been inundated by other perspectives, the way how we use different models of how we use different knowledge, and this comes directly from colonial times, and there's a direct hierarchy of how knowledge is promoted and the way how we promote local indigenous knowledge is something that has been marginalized, has been pushed aside because, as they said, it would not be scientific enough. And since it's not scientific, it should be left aside. And there is a lot of work to do from the African perspective. It is an individual endeavor and then a collective endeavor in order to be part of the debate, in order to try to foster a different perspective on the local context. Since the kindergarten, since school age, we have been educated and trained. So our knowledge providers are regarded as if there were people that have not been capable of transfer knowledge, but we have received the necessary knowledge. It's about writing articles, about writing a thesis, to become part of the global stage. But we are marginalized. We're simply excluded from the scientific arena, and we are only responsible for 3% of the participation of the global production of knowledge. And how is this calculated? And this knowledge is created in Western classical magazines. So everything that we produce, or the knowledge that we produce, but they do not fit in the predefined space predefined by the Western world, it is considered not being knowledge. So once we fall ill, we have our traditional medicine, we have our healers. They do not only heal the body, but the soul as well. So I deal with people that are very much capable of understanding international relations, that are in contact, in exchange with the cosmos, with the nature. And all this knowledge is pushed aside because they say this does not fit in our perspective. But in order to exist and in order to have a voice, I have to publish in certain journals and certain magazines with a certain language, and then have to publish in English, but I'm a French-speaking person. So the whole system, the whole work that we would have to do when it comes to the African continent, it's simply excluded. It is not considered or not deemed appropriate. And in the academia, new proposals have to be put on the table that are opening up a new world. And this is why. And the school, the whole education system, and not only what we teach, but how we teach it, and the language that we use, it is a very important debate that we talk about it. So we do produce our own knowledge, and this is the intelligence of coloniality, the production of knowledge. And I would like to repeat it once again. Excuse me, I'm about done. It's always about dominating the same groups of people. And using the N-word, it's about people having to repeat once and again what is deemed appropriate. And we have to stop working that way. We have to stop using the same structure of production. We have to create beings that have a critical sense and are able to express their own views. Thank you. I would like to ask Beck, because we were talking about possible interventions from scientific areas when it is about artificial intelligence, for example. So there are voices pushing forward, and voices that lead to the fact that we have a different kind of research. So maybe we have a concrete example from artificial intelligence. Whom to? I don't really know. I think we have started out by showing that the challenges of coloniality
et de s'adapter à chaque situation. Aujourd'hui, il faut regarder
and the extraordinary capacity to question oneself, to rethink or reinvent oneself. And a lot is about dominating technology, digital technology. We have controlled societies, surveillance, vigilance, and you have talked about the possibility that different passports provide, and our biometric data is revealed openly, and USA, Russia, and China do distribute those data. So we do not have any digital sovereignty. It would be really important. The same applies to sovereignty when it comes to natural resources. And we know that the most important assets are not diamonds and gas or petrol, oil, but what people are really looking for, what they really want to obtain is data. And since we do not have any sovereignty, the data is saved and secured someplace else, but not on the African continent. So we really have to think about digital science, about technology, and this raises the ethical question of how we deal with personal data. This is something quite central. And we have different associations and researchers that are dealing quite intensely with the fact of how those technologies are used, that they do not pursue a racist idea. So we have a racist technology that identify, that exclude, that refer to certain people that might have a certain race features, although this is not expressed openly, but it's important to take it into consideration. So African researchers have insisted that there have to be algorithms that do not identify the color of the skin of the person that is using the camera. We need an ethical approach when it comes to using personal data and all those algorithms. This is really important. It is crucial because we have entered a new digital era, and the debate on decoloniality is part of the equation. So it's an important tool. So political and cultural sovereignty, technological sovereignty. So there are different debates that have to be led because we are basically controlled and monitored because we, at a very early stage, we have to fight that battle. And this is something that we can facilitate with different trainings, and human sciences have to come back to the universities before we are dominated by technologies that will enslave us once again. The ethical question of control for what is happening when we look at the different technological developments. This has to be controlled by anthropologists and cultural researchers. We have talked about identity, and resources should not be used in order to define our spaces in which we are able to move. So it's like the world is for all of them, but the African continent seems to be remaining a ghetto.
Vielen Dank.
Many, many things. I would like to come back to the topic of art and the cooperation, different joint ventures that might be organized, cooperating between the different continents. Nick, maybe you could just briefly walk us through the dance theater project. And quite precisely of how do you see the willingness of decolonization by different arts and cultural institutions in Germany, like the Humboldt Forum and the Prussian Heritage Association?
So we did a project called Vinyago, Dancing Beyond Colonial Biographies, where we were essentially looking at the East African collection of the Ethnological Museum Berlin, specifically the collection of masks that were taken from the southern region of Tanzania and now are in the holdings of the Ethnological Museum Berlin. And the main issue that we were thinking about it is still about the question of like, what are these masks telling us today in terms of power relation, in terms of like knowledge access, in terms of like who can tell stories, who can tell their own stories, and what's the purpose of that telling. And for the question of like, are the institution within Germany willing to collaborate, to engage in the process of thinking about it, or how do they approach these things? For me, the main thing that we found out is that there are, first of all, there have to be a clear distinction between what an individual wants and what mechanism they are trapped in, right? Because as a museum worker, yeah, they might say like, okay, I see your plight. I know, I think these things should go that way. But essentially, the larger underpinning mechanism that drives this will forward, yes, individuals have a place to play, and there have been a lot of work that have been done within Germany, with people working, whether to change the names of the streets or to address the questions that are specific within Germany. And as well, there are things, there are also questions and concerns that also have been addressed from outside Germany, from the places where this material were taken from. So there is people working in Germany, there's people also from communities of origin that have raise their voice or say something in terms about what does it mean, especially that is our concern within the arts, to have your own voice, to have the access to knowledge, to have the access to knowledge production. And the willingness that exists, or at least it exists in as much as you interact with the certain people that are working with this institution. But past certain level, I still feel there are walls, and I still feel it will take much longer. It will take much diverse approach to even address these things, right? Just for example, just in terms, for example, like in the education system, we learn about colonialism in Tanzania since like primary school. Is it the same in Germany, right? And when this institution and organizations are creating, whether it's museum shows or places of discussion where issues of colonialism are being discussed, it also matters what is the composition of the people that are involved. How